safety and unplanned, unscheduled downtime are the top priorities in any plant. It's not, you need to get that device off my network, or you need to redesign your network. And that could take you a year in one plant to be able to do that without being disrupted.
Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode.
Hello, I'm Craig Duckworth.
And I'm Dino Busalaki.
And today, we're going to be talking about the role of the CISO, how it's evolving, what it's becoming, and where it should go as it relates to the operational technology environment. What are your thoughts, Dino?
And what my thoughts is there a metric demonstrating just how far the CISOs have gotten involved in the industrial cybersecurity space, in your opinion?
I don't think there is a metric, but in my opinion, I would say they've not gotten as involved as they should, because when I interact with clients and organizations, there's still that divide between the IT and the OT, and the CISO doesn't always have the support and buy-in from the asset owners, which are those engineering teams, the plant team on the concrete that own the assets, who are responsible for remediation, responsible for maintaining, responsible for procuring, installing, tuning, and startup of those OT assets. So I don't know about a metric. I know it's not where it needs to be, in my opinion, if that helps.
Well, to your point, I would agree, right? I mean, most of the work that we do to be successful in implementing cybersecurity solutions and strategies and technologies and services, we kind of move through IT to OT, right? I mean, IT will at least recognize that this is an issue. They recognize that they need to do something. I think they're handicapped, hamstrung a little bit, because to your point, their relationship and ownership to those assets on the plant floor are kind of out of their grasp, out of their reach, right? Because they're not responsible for them. They don't own them, right? And coming from the OT world, we don't have CISOs pounding down our door wanting to get more involved from the OT ecosystem, who build the plants, who build the machine centers, who program the control systems to run those manufacturing environments. They're not engaging that ecosystem to understand that environment better, if that makes sense, right? And so so the OT people that own the assets, that are responsible for making the goods, there's a disconnect in this space. There's network connectivity, right? And IT owns part of that network in the plant, but there's usually always that demarc. And that demarc is right around when you get around those kinetic devices, those connected physical systems controlled by digital outcomes. And that's where IT tends to drift off in the work that we do, right? And so when you start thinking about OT cybersecurity platforms per se, and we've witnessed organizations, IT organizations and manufacturers who have bought these tools, these platforms, but yet the OT ecosystem isn't receiving any information on what those OT IDS, for example, platforms are doing, right? They're not part of the collaboration. And so from a CISO perspective, so how do you change that, right? If a CISO's mindset is, you got a Windows 7 machine out there, you need to take it off the network. That's their thought process. And so when their first thought process should be, we're making beer with that Windows 7 machine. Taking that off the network doesn't help the business, right? It doesn't help it. So then the question should be, how does that CISO and his or her staff interact with the owners of that Windows 7 machine to better secure it? What are our options? What can we do? Versus just saying, get it off my network. Well, one, it's not really on your network, number one. And number two, to replace that piece of equipment might cost millions of dollars. And number three, you can't patch it. There's nothing that you can really do to it. So their first instinct is get it off. Well, that shuts down my plant.
Well, the CISOs, I would say, similar to everyone else, they don't know what they don't know. Their primary focus predominantly has been on the enterprise, meaning the carpeted space. They have traditionally not been part of the OT ecosystem, as we say. And two, they're, from a remediation standpoint, a microsegmentation, a compensating controls in your Windows 7 example. How do we put some controls around this device to alert, alarm, to protect, to encrypt, to whatever defense in depth play you want to put to better secure the environment from that machine so that you can still manage your risk and serve the business needs. That's where you got to find that fine line. The CISO has a lot of responsibility when it comes to protecting the organization. They've got to manage the IT, and in cases when they're tasked with the OT environment, they have to learn, they have to be educated. How is it different? How is it similar? What can they do and still be able to present that information to the business, whether that's the board, the CEO, the risk and governance, and how do we address risk? What is our risk tolerance? Where do we fall and what can we do to better support the business? But at the end of the day, the business has to run the business. That CISO can come in and say, we're going to do everything and 100% zero trust everything. You can do that. The business shuts down, but you can do that. That is an option, not a good one. So where's the balance?
Well, you have to be able to determine what the bumps in the road are, right? What are the top two priorities of any manufacturing facility? Safety and removing unplanned, unscheduled downtime, right? And so you have to come at it from that mindset as a CISO, right? You can't come in with your security mindset and say, disconnect, stop, prevent, and then be disruptive, right? Because what OT will do, what we witness them doing, is they'll listen to a point, and then when it becomes to where it's becoming problematic for them to be able to produce goods, they're going to go back to doing what they've always done. And so somehow the narrative needs to shift back to that OT ecosystem. They're the suppliers of these solutions and these technologies, and to some extent are tier 2, tier 3 responsible support partner with that manufacturer, right? It's like you buy a car, yeah, there's certain things that you can do, but when it really comes to troubleshooting issues you're having with your car, when the engine light comes out or the air code comes out, you take it to the shop, right, to solve the problem. Right. And it's the same thing on the plant floor. If my filler is not running optimally, right, or it's dragging or it's stopping, it's becoming problematic. So I have to have somebody come in and take a look at it. And they come in from a whole wide myriad of ways to get in there, right? What is the recent stat? Most clients have at least a handful of different types of remote technologies in their plans for these third parties to gain access to it. So from a CISO's perspective, it's whack-a-mole, right? I mean, and think of the staff that you need. If you got 30, 40, 50, 100 plants in your fleet, having to deal with that, think of the resources that you need to do that, right? And so the mind shift should be, I can't do this with internal resources. I can't do this with resources that are unfamiliar with what these control systems are and what they do. So now I have to become more engaged and involved with the suppliers of these machine centers that I operate inside my manufacturing facilities.
I would argue that probably is the CISO ultimately the decision maker for what risk level the organization is willing to take? Or does that fall to the board of directors or governance? The CISO should help implement the plan, but is he authorized to say, take that machine off of our network and the implications, stopping production or whatever comes with that? Or is it someone else's risk tolerance? I agree. He should say, okay, board of directors or governance committee or whatever that term is, help me understand our organization's risk appetite. And here's the situation. Help me guide. Maybe there are compensating controls that can be put on that are a different approach, not just a rip and replace.
Well, to the point that you made, what is the situation? Do they even really know? Really? They don't. They don't. Not definitively. Not when you've got hundreds and or thousands of assets in your manufacturing environment that come from all over the world that were built by third parties. How are you as a CISO going to be able to cast a net around that, right? And what is the posture that most of them take? They want to put in a firewall. They're looking at a way to segment themselves between IT and OT and call that a day. Versus how do I ensure that packaging line and that filler that's $80,000 an hour worth of revenue keeps doing what it's doing, right? Versus coming in heavy-handed and going, well, we're going to come in here and we're going to put Sentinel One or CrowdStrike on your HMIs, which is not a good idea because those are disruptive technologies, right? That's round peg, square hole. And not recognizing that there's better ways of doing that. And you can integrate into those platforms and use tools that are down there to provide you everything that you need to do your risk assessment and to be able to get your asset inventory and to have your logs and your audits and the things that you need to have to determine how that environment's working and what's my baseline cybersecurity posture, and then what can I do to ratchet it up, right? But that requires a significant level of involvement between two groups that inherently don't work well together.
Well, I'm going to give you a really interesting stat that I learned last week at a conference. So the average CISO, how much time do you think they get in presenting to the board on an annual basis regarding cyber hygiene of the organization? You think board meetings, CISO has to stand in front of the board and present. What's the average amount of time across the annual 12 months that you think that CISO gets to present a cyber posture, OT, IT, whatever is in their control to the board? Take a guess.
I'm going to stab at it. My guess is it happens once a year, and it probably happens for a 2 to 4 hour meeting window.
Okay. Normal CISOs present to the board on a quarterly basis. That's when they get to present, quarterly basis. The average amount of time is 17 minutes a quarter that they get in front of the board to present everything cyber from IT to OT to enterprise wide. They get between 5 and 20 minutes, but the average is 17 minutes a quarter to make their position for funding, for guidance, for recommendations, for whatever they feel is necessary. There's no way that they can adequately understand the OT environment good enough unless they are part of that ecosystem and are immersed in it more so than they are to be able to communicate what is that real risk in 15 minutes if they forwent everything on the IT side.
And even that, right? I was close. I said 1 day versus there was 3 additional days, but I had the time pretty much, right? And then to be able to talk about an environment they know little to nothing about, right? It's one thing to talk about the enterprise, which is probably what out of that 17 minutes, that's probably 15 minutes of their time is talking about the enterprise.
Probably 16 and a half, but close.
Yeah. They may not even get to talk about what's going on the plant floor. So, and still, and the average tenure of a CISO too is still pretty short, right? Still 24 months, less than 3 years.
A couple of years.
Right. So, and you can only, and so again, if you have a lot of plants in your environment, you got a dozen to 100, that becomes exponentially more difficult to be able to manage.
Well, again, it's easy to get lost in the weeds and not fully understand what you're being asked for when you're trying to navigate something completely foreign or unknown to your skill sets.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could always use the sports analogy, right? Where you're playing football, but the IT executive team is playing soccer. They know soccer really well. That's their game, right? It's football, but it's soccer versus US NFL football, a very different sport, right? And yet you're trying to coach that with really not a real good fundamental understanding of how the game is played. including the players that you need, the training that they need, the resources required, the rules of the game. And the plant floor is that way. Again, safety and unplanned, unscheduled downtime are the top priorities in any plant. It's not, you need to get that device off my network, or you need to redesign your network. And that could take you a year in one plant to be able to do that without being disruptive.
Well, I think that there's a couple things that, in my opinion, that really should begin shaping our industry and moving toward, and that's more of a collaborative approach. How can the IT teams and the OT teams work together? Can they become one organization that reports to a particular leader that has responsibility over both, that understands equally as much the importance on uptime, safety, as they do on risk governance? And how do you marry those two and bring together a collaborative team? Let's call it a working group, for lack of a better term, that has 2 or 3 engineers on it, a couple of different controls engineers, plant manager, some process control, some IT people, some risk, and almost like a committee of cross-functional.
It has to be external resources on that. It can't be all internal, right? You can't do this inside, even if you're a very large global company and think that you're doing the right thing, right? You need, just right, if you're a publicly traded company, you're going to have third-party audits. It's just a requirement, right? There's if and ors and buts about it. The same thing needs to happen here. There needs to be external resources with the capabilities who probably understand your vertical pretty well, probably have a lot to do with the plants that they built your plants. They put a lot of the machinery into those plants. They program those machines. They maintain those machines. That relationship is what needs to be fostered, and that's what I don't see happening at a scale to provide direction and strategy in regards to improving cybersecurity posture in your industrial control environment.
Yeah, the at scale is critical to what you just said. There are organizations that can help and guide that can't necessarily deliver, and they say, here's what you should be doing, and then they leave it to the organization to figure out how that works. And I bet you if I've talked with one plant engineer, I've talked with 1,000 of them, and every one of them is working 60 hours a week, getting paid for a standard 40 because of their salary. They've got 15 jobs. They're barely getting 12 of them done. And they for sure do not want extra work to do to try and figure something else out. No. They are all passionate, and they all are very driven to do what's right to help their organization. But there's only so many hours in a day, and they just can't continue to do because
they focus on what they know. They do. We've seen that. I mean, we've seen CIOs that basically will turn a blind eye to the plant because they don't have the resources, they don't have the time for all the things that you just described. So they got to focus on the things that they can focus on and the things that they know, right? And the landscape is changing. The threats are evolving. I mean, look what came out on the news today and how they're using pagers as weapons, right? Again, the landscape is continually evolving, and it's no different. And so how do you stay abreast of that, right? And if you're not working with outside groups, especially outside groups that have just a deep understanding, that are deeply rooted into the OT environment and how these machines are set up and how they operate and how they're connected and what they're supposed to be doing, how are you going to marry that relationship? And I'm not saying that it can't be done, but what I witness is that it's not being done. I mean, how many businesses have we been into that have bought a tool that IT's got and the OT guys aren't receiving any benefit or any value from the data from an OT cybersecurity platform that the IT guys bought, and or their partners that they work with?
Yeah, and OT is still trying to catch up to IT. I get it. IT's had a 25-year running head start. Conceptually, I fully get that, but they have to make changes, and the landscaping is changing so quickly. You know, prior to today, when the pager started blowing up, I would have never given 1 second of thought to, should I put my phone to my ear and make a call? To me, that's scary. the technology is there. I get to different environment, different situation, but as organizations are now trying to figure out what is right and what is wrong, other organizations, there's no line they won't cross, whether that is geopolitical, whether that is sabotage and chaos, whether that is ransomware, what makes no difference. We that have, I would call, morals and values are really different than organizations or people or whoever that has no distinguished. They just go, and they don't care what damage is done.
Right. And for those that are relying on cybersecurity insurance to bail them out, are in for a rude awakening.
That's a mistake. Yeah,
it is, right? Because there's a lot to think that, right? I got a $20 million policy. Well, that's to help you remediate and mitigate what happened to you, but it's not for the business disruption that you had, for the millions of dollars you probably lost by not making goods for a while, right? That's money that's gone, right? Your operational costs, they're just gone, right? And so, but there are people out there that say, well, I got a big insurance policy, I'll be okay. It's no, you won't. You have 30 plants shut down for a few weeks. Do the math, right? And you probably know those numbers because you went through COVID. You got a pretty good idea, right? So there's that aspect of it also for those that are out there relying on cybersecurity insurance to get them out of a spot.
Well, if you just do some real quick dirty math, if I'm an organization and I do $12 billion annually, $1 billion a month, and I have a cyber event and my facility is offline for 1 week, not a real long time, but for 1 week, that is $250 million. $250 million for a week. That's a big number.
And let's say that's 12 plants, right? And now you've lost 12 plants for that week. More like a month, because the average downtime impacted once these things evolve and those material breaches get into your plant, you're looking at a month or longer to get back up and running.
Yeah. It's not an easy overnight process. It gets more expensive. The requirements from a vendor, and again, I heard this from the conference last week, is how are organizations on both sides, the end user pushing back and requiring secure by design. And a new word that I heard, which is interesting to say the least, is secure by demand, meaning that we will not procure this unless you do X, whether that is added into it, modify it, give us the code so we can validate it, whatever that is.
But how often do you think that's happening? I mean, generally speaking.
I would say not very, but I look at our organization and some of the pushback that we're receiving then and that we're giving from a procurement vendor relationship from a supply chain. Look at critical choke points. Regardless of where it is, if you rely on one vendor to supply a particular thing in your environment, but that vendor, let's say you make beer and you buy your can from XYZ, and so does every other beer maker in the country. If that can maker has a problem and it affects all the beer production in the country, that's an issue.
They'll be filling up a lot of kegs.
They'll be doing a lot of something, that's for sure.
And then don't forget, you also have the SEC who's imposing rules, especially on publicly traded companies, where you have to disclose to your investors within, 48 hours or something like that?
72, I believe, yeah.
If you have a material breach, so they can decide on whether they want to stick around or not and leave their money with you, right? And so, again, attack to your brand and to your investment supply chain is all at risk, right? I mean, we make this sound like it's unachievable, but it's not, though. It's really, really not. It's about putting the right players in place and having conversations and have real conversations to get past the myths and the hearsay and the naysayers, right? And IT needs to be humbled, I think, to some extent, because their practices don't always fit in that control system environment.
Well, yeah, it's got to be cooperation. It's got to be teamwork. It's got to be both sides wanting to solve the problem, but you got to start somewhere. You can't continue to ignore it. You can't let it go. You got to reach out to organizations that can help you, that can support you, that are working in that environment, that are there to be a partner to you and say, look, we know we have problems. Help us understand the extent of how bad they are, and help us work through, prioritize, and figure out how we can start addressing them. But you're right. You can't, you got to pull your head out of the sand. You got to look up. You got to stand tall. You got to march forward. And you got to say, we're going to eat this elephant one bite at a time. If it takes us 5 years, we are going to do this.
Well, it's either that or they're focused on other problems, I guess they feel, that are bigger.
Well, you can't be lucky every single day. I'm just going to tell you. Every day, the bad guys only got to get lucky one time. You got to be lucky every minute of every day to make sure that nothing happens. You can't. Statistics don't lie. Statistics are not on your side.
You got to get to the know, right? You can't be philosophical. You got to get to the know. And to me, the know is you need to know exactly how that plant operates. Physical connected systems controlled by digital outcomes. How is that all put together and how does it work? And what can impact it, right?
Great conversation. We could talk for 3 weeks on this and it would still be there. I think it was, hopefully organizations can take from this. They can go back to their leadership team, their internal teams and say, okay, what questions do we need to start asking ourselves to get to the know, as you would say, and how do we start addressing the gaps that come out of that?
Yeah. And educate yourself. Go to events coming up in October, Chicago. And there's S4X 25 that's in after the first of the year. There's Rockwell Automation Fair. There's many, many events that you can go and get educated in this space. And I encourage IT people to participate in industrial events that there's technology conversations being had. And then there's our podcast. So you can look at it from a practitioner's view of folks that work in these manufacturing environments every single week.
Yeah, nope. Great conversation, Dino. Thank you very much. Hopefully the listeners get something out of this. You guys have a great day.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.